I just want to start with the question that recently India-Pakistan conflict and, post-India-Pakistan conflict, there are so many things, and it's a ceasefire time now. But do you think this conflict can escalate, the situation can get worse in near future?
Well, if you look at the history of India-Pakistan relations, there is a pattern that when things get really bad with a serious crisis or indeed a war, that you do sometimes see a period of calm. And if we look at the last serious crisis between India and Pakistan in 2009, when you had the Pulwama Balakot crisis, 2 years after that crisis, India and Pakistan came together and they signed a new truce, a new LOC truce in 2021. So I think that suggests that perhaps there's a possibility for the relationship to improve, but I would actually argue that these past historical patterns may not apply in this case. And one reason for that is that the conflict that India and Pakistan were involved in last month was especially serious. I would describe it as the most hostilities we've seen between India and Pakistan since their war in 1971. And when you have such a serious conflict with such high levels of escalation, it takes a long time to walk that back. So that's one reason why I think it'll be difficult to de-escalate. The second reason is the fact that you had so many steps taken by India during the early days of the crisis that were punitive in nature. They were not military steps. They were non-military, things like suspending the Indus Waters Treaty, shutting down the only open land border, and cutting off all trade with Pakistan. That really limits the scope for diplomatic space for India and Pakistan to engage in any type of dialogue. So I do think that even though there is a ceasefire in place, and I do think the ceasefire will hold, in terms of diplomacy and relations on the whole, I think it's going to be very difficult to reduce tensions and return things to a bit of a more normal place for the relationship. I think the tensions will last for quite some time.
As you were saying, recently the complex situation between India and Pakistan, and recently Shashi Tharoor visited Washington and, Capitol Hills. Do you think they could achieve anything out of it, and what compelled them to go over there with their narrative?
It's very striking that India has put together this major set of delegations that it's sending all around the world, almost to every corner of the world, not just the United States. This is a government in India that likes to project itself as being very, very confident, very nationalistic, and doesn't really care what critics think. And yet it really is looking to get international buy-in. The fact that it's sending these very prominent members of parliament and former ambassadors to every corner of the world. So I think that's a bit of an irony right there. I think that on one level, India already has the world's support. I mean, one of India's major goals with this delegation is to try to focus the attention back on terrorism and what it of course views as Pakistan-sponsored terrorism in India. And I would argue that Washington and other key capitals, particularly in the West, are very sympathetic to these Indian concerns about this idea of India being targeted by terrorist attacks that have some type of link to Pakistan. There is a lot of support, I would argue, from Washington and other capitals for that. However, I think that the issue here is that what we saw in this most recent crisis, and this has been a pattern in terms of recent crises, initially you had an attack, which I would describe as an act of terrorism, but then it provoked a certain response in which you had Indian airstrikes, and then you had an escalation, and you had a brief conflict. And for much of the world, including Washington, the attention focused at that point away from terrorism and more toward the issue of escalation, and especially nuclear escalation risks. That became a big concern for Washington and others. And India would prefer that the world not focus as much on the nuclear escalation risks and would focus more on the terrorism issue. And that's where I think New Delhi will have some challenges with this delegation. It's not going to get the world to simply overlook the idea of nuclear escalation risks. It's only natural, given that India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons, and given that they have been willing to engage in military hostilities against each other under the nuclear umbrella, it's only natural that when India and Pakistan have a military crisis, that Washington and other capitals will be very concerned about that, and they'll think more about escalation risk than they will about the terrorism issue. So Bottom line, I think India, the delegation will be able to get that sympathy that it's already gotten from the world on the issue of terrorism, but it's not going to be very easy to convince the world to simply overlook this idea of nuclear escalation, just because that's something that's very hard to overlook, given the dynamics, given the escalation dynamics we've seen between India and Pakistan, and given the concerns that many key capitals